Hello everyone. Just wait a couple of seconds for people to join in, and we'll wait for Dhananath to join the call as well.
How are you
I'm
doing,
fine.
Akhila?
How about you? Okay.
Keeping well. Getting prepared for
Is
the
it?
New Year holiday.
We're coming up on that very soon.
Not really.
Yeah,
Shall we
sure. Go ahead.
start?
I'm good.
Or you want?
Hi.
Sure. I'm ready.
Yeah.
Let's start.
So just wanted to welcome everyone to our live session. I don't know if you guys have been keeping up with our social media, but today we're going to be talking about specifically the petroleum market and how I think last week Minister Kanchana said that they're going to be introducing three more players into the petroleum market in addition to CPC and LIOC. And today we thought we'd talk about, how, well, first of all, how it's a good step in the right direction for us as a country, and whether the dissent that is brought forward in society is something that is valid, and how we should move on from what we are at status quo and what we can expect at least within the near future.
Yes, Akhil, I think there's a first the confusion whether it's a privatization or whether it is opening up the markets. From what I understand, is mainly it is opening up the market for more players rather than a privatization. Because from what I heard, I think Minister Kanchana joined a conversation at Dhananath. So what he said was there's about 1,200 fuel stations or like distribution centers, and out of that there are I think about 200 to 300 fuel stations which is completely owned by the Petroleum Corporation. So they have left it aside, and out of that 900, so basically they are giving out those 450 fuel stations to the new three players. uh, so uh, so then at the same time they're also trying to give another 50 new stations for all three new players as well. So it looks like it's opening up the market rather than a privatization, because they are not trying to tap for anything at the petroleum. It's only the licensing process, and also the 150 fuel stations that they are going to give. It is mainly it is mainly owned by private operators like you and I, and it was a licensing process like the alcohol, what do you call
Right.
the alcohol licenses, that which is pretty much given by the excise department, and also like the private route permits given by the respective agencies. So that's how I understood it. But I think it's important to have many more players. I know this is not sometimes everyone's view. Not that everyone agrees with what we say. That is perfectly fine. But I think it's important to have a market system, because that's basic, that the market system should work. And even countries like India, there are multiple players, having being the Indian oil company being the owned by the state, but there are multiple players in the market, and I think that's the fundamental principle, that we don't put all our eggs in one basket. So you should have a significant supplier diversification if you really want to secure your supply chain in any business. It could be for any private business. So I think that's important, that we have a reasonable diversification. Akhila, I was told that there's a lag. Shall I connect through my mobile connectivity till you
Sure.
continue
It
the
seems fine on my end,
conversation?
but yeah, if that seems better.
Okay, I'll join back through my mobile connection.
Okay. Um, so leaving off where Dhananath spoke about, he spoke about how not having eggs in one basket, and I think that was very prominent when we had the whole fuel crisis in our country, when CPC and the state did not have the foreign reserves or the reserves, capital reserves to import, and couldn't get LCs to import oil because we as a country did not have any futures contracts for oil. We saw the country come to a standstill, right? Because then and then it was only in that instance that we saw the beauty of having one other additional player in the market through LIOC, because they had the ability and the know-how to make sure that fuel distribution and supply went without an issue. And even if you have to look at CPC as an entity, right? I think the numbers are so far that they're at 800 billion debt, and out of that, I think 300 of that is owed to the treasury. I'm not too sure if my numbers are accurate there. But if you look at something like LIOC, something that only has 10% of the, sorry, give me a second. Right there. Yeah. As I was saying, something that only has 10% of the distribution market in Lanka, Indian Oil Company, they are still able to produce magnificent amounts of profits, despite only having a minimal share of the market. And that is at the same time with the price cap that the state has said that was historically, subsidized. Now, sure, I think we released a statistic on this that to say that CPC has only produced profits 1 year, if I'm not mistaken, that was in 2016. But we also need to take that with a grain of salt, because that was the point in time when Brent crude oil prices were at its lowest, taking out the anomaly of COVID, where a barrel was below $10. But, at times like that, we need to understand that perhaps the state does not have any business being in the business of selling petrol. Perhaps at some point in time, they can take a regulatory stance, to make sure that certain things like price gouging don't happen. And that's something I wanted to throw to you, Dhananath. A lot of issues that people had was, if the market itself is completely given up by the state and given over to private entities, what reassurance do we as consumers have other than market forces to make sure that price gouging doesn't happen?
Exactly, Akhil. I think we definitely have to have a regulatory mechanism. Of course, we believe in markets, but the regulatory mechanism is very important. So, as far as I see, there's no regulatory mechanism at this point. But from what I heard, there's enough room through the Public Utilities Commission to regulate the fuel market, because anyway the price controls and everything being imposed through that through multiple acts. So I think a regulatory mechanism is very important. So that is a loophole that I see. Ideally, in an idealistic case, when there's competition, anyway the prices should come down. But I think since people also have some suspicion whether they will coordinate the price and make some super profits, so then I think regardless of that, we definitely need to have a regulatory process that has to be set up. I think that's quite important. Which of course, because this is a high risk industry, because on transportation of fuel, on storage of fuel, the quality control measures has to be adhered. I think the best example is on the telecommunication industry when the market was allowed the other players to enter. There's a telecommunication telecommunication regulatory authority was set up, if I'm not mistaken. So there, if you recall, during that time, even there were call charges for incoming calls, and there were call charges for when you see the number of the person who is calling from the other end. So when we eliminate all that, when the competition was allowed. So I think in ideal case, when you have more players in the market, because everyone wants to have a better market share, better profit. So basically they try to bring the efficiency into the consideration, and they try to bring the prices down. I think even if you look at one of the main questions that everyone asks is how come the Lanka IOC makes such huge profits while the Petroleum Corporation is making so much losses. Of course, their refineries in India is very, very efficient and productive than the refineries here, and they can buy it, because since they are buying it from the IOC company there, they have, of course, bulk discounts that they can always have the access. So that's an advantage for them. So basically, they can afford to have a lower price. But here they didn't basically do it, because you only have two players, and they know the Petroleum Corporation inefficiencies. They can't anyway. No point selling it at a lower price, because they have pretty much a market saturated point with the number of fuel stations and the distributions that they have got. And also there's an agreement between the Lanka IOC and the Petroleum Corporation, according to the current setup, that they have to take a approval from the Petroleum Corporation even to do a price revision, increase or a decrease. So with that, I think that's the context. But definitely, when there are more players, it's basic market economics. Prices should come down. Even if it's not coming down, I think the regulatory agency can intervene in that sense, which is not recommended. But even if people have any suspicion, I think that's one way to consider about it. But I think ideally, what we have been recommending, Akhila, as you know, a competition commission, because when you ensure the competition, that's how it happens in other parts of the world. You impose the competition. So the competition ideally should bring the prices down, as we spoke about on the telco industry. That's how I see.
Yeah, and also to your point, I mean, we've seen the Brent oil prices and even flat prices, fluctuating. I think this year itself, a large amount, and certain times we don't see those in the current setup, at least those benefits being passed on to the consumer because of CPC's such large debt, that any profit that they do make has to be used to pay off any credit or liabilities that they've accrued throughout the past. So maybe not to talk about privatization of it as completely, but perhaps we can look at bringing in more players, because I think 150 sheds per oil company in the grand scheme of things spread out throughout Sri Lanka, because we don't know exactly what the distribution of it's going to be, right? Whether it's going to be mostly Colombo or whether it's going to be the outstations and whatnot. I think it's a good starting step, but I don't think the buck should stop there. I think there should be more competitive and transparent bidding processes for these companies to come in, not just the three that have been accepted by the ministry. And I think, like you said, competition factors can also play into us getting a better product at the end of the day, because I think it's something that we missed out. I think in a while, I think petrol stations in the recent past have not been open for longer periods of time. They shut down at 11 o'clock. Maybe we can look into things like more 24-hour petrol stations, or perhaps, by allowing more innovation and more technologies into the market, perhaps you can see things like, self-servicing fuel stations, small things like this that just add to quality of life of people, and at the end of the day, it just makes life so much better.
Absolutely, Akhil. I think definitely. I think even if you go back when the Lanka IOC company or like the Indian Oil company entered the market, if you recall, I was a schoolboy. Then actually the prices were written in paint at the petrol pumps, and the quality of the fuel stations were, I mean, unbelievable. You only have like a manual pump. It's like an old scoreboard where the numbers are rotating, and people complain that there's air being carried out with the pump, and they basically they cheat when they pump fuel. And there were no toilets, nothing at that sort at the fuel stations. And then with the competition, things drastically changed. You had digital pumps, and even when Labs entered, there were mini supermarkets at fuel stations. So basically, you really can't say that nothing has happened. There's competition has shown results on fuel stations. But it is true that for the reasons that we spoke about, the prices haven't come down. But I think one thing that people forget is the losses that the Petroleum Corporation have made. I think it is an unbelievable amount. I know there's also debatable. For the last 8 months, we have been speaking about it quite a lot. 632 billion losses for 8 months. Of course, it is mainly because of the exchange rate loss. But just because of its exchange rate loss doesn't mean that someone is paying for it. It is basically people have to pay for it. And 632 billion is, Akhila, our expenditure on healthcare and education, which are the two main expenditure line items in the budget, is about 550 billion. So basically, for one institute, we are paying more than our health and education expenditure. And as we all know, 70% of fuel is being consumed by the wealthiest of the society. Because basically the people who drive V8s and BMWs, no offense on them, but they are the one who are basically using quite a bit of fuel. It is like the normal people won't. I mean, so someone who is going in a bus or a motorbike, they are using fuel, but it's a small quantities, small, compared to what is being used by the wealthiest of the society. So basically, we have provided a massive subsidy for the wealthiest of the people at the expenditure of health and education of our own people. And the other argument is okay, it was just a one-off loss, but it is not. I was just calculating the losses from 2005. So, Akhila, from 2005, we have made a cumulative loss of 1 trillion rupees. 1 trillion since 2005. So even if you consider from 2015, only 3 years, as you very correctly mentioned, 3 years we have made profits. And those profits are comparatively to our asset base, which is about 400 billion. Even if you liquidize 400 billion and put it on a fixed deposit, you can earn about 40 billion easily without doing anything. So even if you now the interest rates are more than 10%. So if you compare the magnitude of the profits, even when you make a profit, it is not justifying the asset base that you are utilizing from the economy in this context. And also, I don't think you can say other players should not enter. I think that's a very unfair statement. It is like imagine if I am running a bakery in my area, I can't say other bakers cannot enter my territory just because I am running a bakery. It's very unfair. Of course, they should be allowed, and I should be able to compete under any circumstances. So I think we have to allow the markets to work and the other players to enter. So I think people should be more vigilant about the number of power, like the gravity of these losses, and which has, of course, we know it has caused so many problems on getting this affected to the banking sector and our electricity board, our airline, everyone has got affected with this. So I think people have to be careful about it. And even if we consider, if we leave the 632 billion loss, which is a like outlier loss for the last year, still it is almost ₹1 trillion for the last since 2005. So which I don't think we can justify under any circumstances. Because ₹1 trillion loss is a big loss. And I haven't taken the net present value, it's just like the value. So basically the losses in earlier years means quite a lot than the losses we made recently, even if you discount for the inflation.
I think people need to also take into account, because if we take that 600 billion loss and we try to adjust it to how much per individual in Sri Lanka has to pay back, I think it comes down to something like 28,700 rupees or something like that. And when you look at things like the national poverty line or what the state has told the society, apparently 10,000 or 30,000 rupees is enough for a family of three to live on. So if you take those numbers, the average person is expected to output twice the amount that of 13,000 to just incur or just cover the losses that the CPC is making. And I mean, also we need to understand that certain state agencies, SOEs, are not following basic decorum, in the sense that they aren't even publicizing their annual reports. So we really don't know, in some cases, where these losses are made, as in, instead of just saying that a loss is made, we don't know exactly where the bloated costs are. And perhaps when you can shrink the market share that the state owns, perhaps, the state is forced to take unpopular measures that can make it a profitable entity. I mean, we can't completely dismiss it as a loss-making entity in the future as well. And maybe that competition and the innovation that can be brought in through, I think it was Shell, United, and Sinopec, if I'm not mistaken. That can also help. At the end of the day, I think this is a good decision that can help us in the long run.
Yeah, I also feel I have the same sentiments, Akhil. I think because we have to allow the markets to work. That's very important, and we are allowing the competition to work. I think the regulatory and the transparency issue that you brought up is very important. At the same time, it will also provide a lot of space for the budget, because when you can reduce the losses, that have a lot of space in the national budget as well. On the other hand, I think the main argument was whether we can eliminate it through, the losses are incurred because of corruption, and we had to eliminate corruption, and that is a solution. I think that is true. Of course, there's corruption definitely, we all know there's excess number of workers being employed by the political authorities over a period of time. But the challenge is even for a company to make it, to minimize the corruption, the market system should work, because when you are only competing in a market system, you have an incentive to minimize corruption, because otherwise it won't affect, because you have the motivation when you see that you can't compete in a market environment. So I think even to minimize the corruption, it's quite important that we have a market system and more players, and that's what also what we see in India. They have multiple players. China, of course, their company has been listed in the stock exchange. Of course, Chinese model is different. So anyway, for most of the companies, they have a state-run system. But there was a discussion, even the Chinese companies to come onto like a Temasek model and to run their state ITs.
Yeah, and
sorry, I'm getting a call. That's why I disconnected.
I think on your point of corruption and how we can hold things more accountable. I think today there was a news alert. LIOC had taken out the licenses of 28 sheds because they were not adhering to the quota system. And I can speak on that anecdotally as well, because I think mistakenly when I went to pump fuel once, the attendee had accidentally charged us thrice. And, they were panicking, and we were like, it's fine, you just pay us that amount, it's completely fine, human error is completely okay. But they were a bit more cautious, because they said, that the individual from the company comes and they check the amount of money that they get, the income versus how much fuel they put out. And, there's a certain level of accountability and transparency in systems. When I think that the state is no longer involved, because I think we have to admit that at this point in time, that whenever the state is involved, unfortunately, even though this is not what we would like to say, that there is an amount of incompetency and a bit of corruption that does go a long way, because bureaucratic systems, I mean, that's the nature of it, with bureaucratic systems, you need things like corruption do kick in order to make things work faster. But perhaps, like to your point, maybe we can't quell corruption at the state level, but perhaps bringing in more players can incentivize the state to not take part in such things,
Absolutely. That's a good case. What is your view, Akhila, on also I think the other conversation is on the national security front. What is your take on it? How this would affect on the national security front?
Well, I've always found this entire boogeyman of national security to be such a straw man that people use whenever there is some sort of not even dependency, but just outsourcing of necessary assets, if I could say that. Because I mean, realistically, it's not like we're handing over our refineries or the entire, the petroleum terminals that we have. We're just allowing private entities to come into the state and distribute fuel to us. But at the same time, with something as fragile as and important as energy, I do see the validity of national security being a problem. But it's not like we're going to be solely buying from, let's say, what would it be? Like, I don't know, where we hand over all of our fuel distribution to Sinopec. And therefore, we allow the entire market to be dominated by one entity. So I don't really see this personally, at least, I don't see this argument of national security being such a important one. But what do you think about that now?
Yeah, I think, okay, I think there's a concern on national security, but concern in the sense, the worst case could be you only have one supplier, because that's a massive threat for national security, because on any risk assessment, what we try to do is to diversify the risk. So basically, when you have only multiple suppliers only, you can basically, if one supplier have an issue, so then actually we can diversify it. I think that's what we experienced during the crisis, because basically everyone lined up in front of Lanka IOC because at one point they were the only people who could brought fuel. But of course, there was a limitation on the distribution because they have about 15 to 17% market share. So I think diversifying
Yeah.
is an important point when you consider even the national security because that's how you can limit. But even if you think, okay, having the government is the best way to ensure national security, what we experienced was is completely the opposite because we didn't have fuel. Even if there was a threat to real national security, if there was a terrorist attack or something, no one could move. Even the defense forces
Yeah.
had a difficult time. And finally, the prices were doubled or even
Yeah.
more than doubled, and we are still on a quota system. So just because the state supplying doesn't mean that we are ensuring the national security because the current system is a state-led system. So I don't see any. I think the best thing to do is to diversify the supply chains, but of course having a regulatory authority because the state ultimately own the land and everything. So no one can stay without their consent. So basically, I don't think giving it to outsiders as a threat to national security because no one really want to lose the business because they are doing significant investment. You have to
Yeah.
look on that context. So I think the reasonable way to think or rational way to think about it is to have more players because that's how you diversify your risk factors.
Yeah,
That's how I see it,
in
Akhila.
the fuel quota system, Dana, do you think that perhaps by allowing more players into the market and allowing them to have more access to refineries, of wherever accessible, whether it's India or Singapore or whatever, do you think that perhaps, I believe that it's June that these sheds are supposed to be handed over and the transition is going to work through. Do you think by then that perhaps we can move out of this quota system? Because I feel like that in itself currently while it's better than what it was a year ago, where no one had fuel, but even the limitation of this is causing a lot of strife that we are taking in with a pinch of salt.
No, absolutely. I think the fuel quota system, because because with the high prices, anyway, people have cut down their consumption. So when you have a price reflective mechanism, regardless of a quota or not, you basically cut it down. And of course, on a monetary point of view, when you are not adding more money into the system, it has to automatically balance. So I think with more players coming in, of course, they can have a different system because they are basically bringing fuel from their dollars or from their reserves. But of course, they have to make it. They have to, of course, when they are taking the profits out, it has to be in dollar terms, unless they have a other interest in investing in rupees in Sri Lanka. So I think, of course, that can be a value addition for them. They can say, okay, from our sheds, we have a different quota for fuel, which can be a one selling point. But I think in ideal world, Akhila, we are living in 21st century. It's not the quota system that everyone wants to make, like, rather than the state making decisions to bring the self-discipline and like the decision-making process has to be within our control. So I think that's the most important thing. But pretty much, I think the quota system will slowly go away. But with the price reflective mechanism, people, of course, have to make a
Right, right.
decision on where they have to consume. Even if they consume more on fuel, of course, they have to cut it down from somewhere. Because when you have like a limited number of resources, if you are spending more on vehicles and fuel, of course, you have to cut it down from
Will
somewhere. So
balance
the
itself.
system
Yes.
automatically should
Yeah.
balance itself.
Um, yeah.
Uh,
Sorry, is there anything you wanted to add?
no, I think we covered quite a lot. I think the one main criticism is mainly I think the negatives that we have been seeing on social media is mainly it is corruption and it is on the threat on the national security and the prices may not come down. Were the main like concerns that people had. I think we pretty much shared our view, and of course, what I always say is you need not to change your point of view just because of what we say. We are just trying to add context with company or that. You can of course you are welcome to be entitled to your like your opinion. That's perfectly fine. But we want to add a more data driven approach into the context.
But yeah, I also think I agree with you vehemently that we've covered everything that can be covered on a topic as important, but also very narrow in its interpretations and availability. And I don't think the audience has too many questions or none from what I see. So I'd like to thank you, Dhananath, for joining me today and helping me enlighten myself
Thanks, Akhila.
with the quagmire that is the petroleum issue in Sri Lanka. So I wish you a good evening and see you around.
Thank you. Thank you, Akhila. Have a good evening. See you around. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.